Well, we're up to chapter 8 and some of my favorite groups, the adolescents. We've all survived it. Let's learn a little bit more about it. Well, we know one of the biggest things that's happening in adolescent is this change in physical maturation. Basically, our body's going to go through this process of becoming from the child body to the adult body, which basically means that we're going to start creating sexually mature bodies. Now, what is interesting is that when we look at the bodies of young people, the first things that grows are like their hands, their heads, and their feet. That's why we sometimes look at boys and they got these big old clubby feet. The next bones to grow are going to be your tubular bones, and then finally your trunk. As we've mentioned before, there is going to be a difference in the growth rate of males and females. We know that girls are going to start about 2 years before boys, and this is just simply a process of getting that body ready to grow. Now, at the bottom of this slide, you see basically this chart. Now, this chart is in your book. And so one of the first things that's interesting to look at is that this is the growth per year, and this is the pounds gained per year. So each one is showing us something slightly different than the other one. Now, when we look at the growth per year and we begin to look at the girls, you can see that right around here is where we hit the peak, and that's about 12 years of age. Whereas the boys' peak, which is right next to it, is going to happen right around 13 or 14. Now that is assuming that a boy or a girl is hitting the normal growth spurt, meaning is that they aren't a little delayed or a little ahead. And then as far as pounds, those tend to follow just before or just after those. So there you are for the boys, and there are the girls. Now, again, these charts are to help us understand whether or not somebody is right on target, or if they're falling behind, or they're even a little bit ahead. As far as the brain is concerned, we do have brain growth happening at this time, although as my little picture kind of shows here, sometimes it feels like it's a little bit backward. But basically, we know the brain is about 95% of its adult size. And we're only going to gain about another 5% by the end of adolescent. And remember, for this class, we're looking at adolescents sort of between the ages of 12 and 20. We do know that the brain of a human kind of grows until about 25 years of age. Now, one of the things that this slide talks about is this pruning. And what we're talking about here is that as we are growing up, there's lots of stuff that we have in our head. And then after a while, our head begins to start saying, well, do I really need that information? So our synapses will begin to prune, basically away the things that it does not appear we're going to need to know or use, which is why you might say at one point you knew all the capitals of the United States, and now, all those states' capitals, they're disappearing for you. That pruning, though, is a way to help us begin to have space for what we begin to specialize in, you might want to say. However, the pruning also tends to cause more risky behavior because a lot of times our inhibitors, they've been, as they say, swamped. But basically, we have a lack of inhibitors. Things that right now might make you say, don't know about that. That's sort of what teens may be lacking at this time. With sexual maturity, we do need to understand the difference between our primary and our secondary maturations. Now, primary to me has always been pretty easy to figure out. Why? Because if it's a primary item, it means that it has to be there or there's no baby. So I can ask you, if I don't have breasts, could I still have a baby? And the answer is yes, which means that those are not primary sexual characteristics. In fact, something like breasts are a secondary sexual characteristic. Could we still have a baby if there was not a scrotum? And the answer is probably no, because we wouldn't have any sperm. Thus, that's a primary sexual characteristic. So that's the easiest way to be able to identify. And yes, on the test, you're going to have to be able to identify whether something's a primary or secondary sex characteristic. But keep thinking of it this way. If it's not there and you can still have a baby, then it's got to be secondary. But if it's not there, then there's no baby, such as ovaries, then you know it's going to be a primary. Which brings us to sort of the psychological impact of puberty. And here we really talk more about body image because we are sort of in that physical aspects. We know teen girls tend to be far more critical about their appearance, and this starts pretty early. Why? Because maturation starts early. So girls who have matured a little bit earlier, they tend to get more attention, they tend to get more noticed, you might want to say. They may not be ready for it at 12 or 13, but they get noticed. So other girls want to go ahead and mature. So being a late maturing female, quite often, um, that may make them feel something is wrong with them. Why don't they have the right appearance? With boys, what's kind of interesting is that they tend not to be pleased if their image of what they think a young man should look like doesn't match what they have. So you see the image of the young man at 15, 16, and 17, and he's pretty happy with himself because he's sort of looking what he thinks he should look like at those age, or what he thinks a male body should look like. Now, what is interesting is that the boys will lose this again as they get a little bit older, and girls get a little bit better about body image as they get a little bit older. One of the hypotheses on why this tends to occur is that we have left sort of this childhood time and this time that we tended to separate ourselves by gender, meaning the girls tended to hang out with the girls and the boys tended to hang out with the boys, and that now we're coming back to be sexual creatures and to attract mates, you might want to say. And so both groups want to attract what they consider to be the most successful mate. And thus we are very concerned with how we're going to do that. And it may be based on our body, it may be based on our finances, but we know that both groups tend to do this. So for boys, the interesting thing is if they don't maturate early, if they tend to be a late maturator, that tends to have a much greater psychological negative impact on them than girls. While girls may not be happy about not maturating early, they don't seem to have suffer as much consequences for that. In fact, for girls, maturating too early can be the problem because a 12-year-old with bosoms quite often gets hit upon, and she's not psychologically ready to be considered a sexual object yet. But the truth is, from the outside world, a lot of people don't know this is a 12-year-old because she has a full bosom, and then they think, oh, she must be older than she is. So for boys, a little younger is good to maturate. For girls, a little older. Which brings us to moodiness. Now, almost all the people, when I first ask them, they'll say, oh, moodiness is because of the hormones. But I want you to look at that last bullet right there. Increased and rapid increase in hormones is generated to greater irritability and impulse, but it is not moodiness. Oops, that just completely took it away. Let me take that away. But it is not moodiness. Basically, moodiness in teens comes more from the fact that they are now being challenged to do things they haven't done before. Their social activities are changing more. They're responsive more for things. I always remember my nephew who joked about the magic closet. And his joke was is that when he was younger, the magic closet just always seemed to be full of things. So when he needed toilet paper, he opened up and the magic closet was there. And when he needed toothpaste, he opened up the closet and it was there. And that as he got older, that magic closet wasn't working so well. And one day he opened up the magic closet and there was no toilet paper, no deodorant, no toothpaste, no anything. And he kind of turned to his mother and he said, "Where is everything?" And she said, "I don't know. When was the last time you went shopping?" So he, of course, got very irritated and was all moody about that. I don't want to go shopping. And he says he kind of distinctly remembers this because it, to him, as he called it, the magical closet. And as he got older, he realized that, he was old enough to go shopping at that point, but all of a sudden he had this new responsibility he didn't have before. Before, it just filled up by itself. So moodiness is not about hormones. Moodiness is more about this change in activity, this change in what we have an expectation of. The hormones may increase our irritability and being more impulsive, but it's not moodiness. Now, we talk about rates of maturation. Basically, early maturator in boys are around 11 and girls are 9. Yes, we do have girls who maturate at 9. Later maturations for boys are 15 or 16 and girls for 14 or 15. Now, the effect of the sexual activity of these people will vary among ethnic groups. We know that in many areas of Asia, you see late maturating for both girls and boys. You may have noticed in the Olympics when you see a female gymnast, you're like, I cannot believe that female gymnast is 16. She looks like she's 12. Or maybe you've seen some sort of a spelling competition, and there's a young boy who steps up, and you can hardly believe that that boy is in 8th grade because he looks so young. But it really does sort of depend on your ethnic background. And it's even more than your ethnic background, it's really your genetic background. So your rate of maturation is really more of a nature rather than a nurture aspect. If you found that your parents maturated early, there's a good chance you're going to maturate early. And of course, if your parents maturated later, there's a good chance you're going to maturate later. With nutrition, we do have girls having to sort of get down to that 2,000 calories a day, and the boys, they get a little bit more, 27. What we do find is that they need extra iron, especially boys for muscles and girls, but they both also need calcium. What happens is at this time they may stop drinking calcium, milk, or getting calcium from other areas, and so they may lag in calcium for what they need. The biggest problem with teens is that quite often they are beginning to get more calories per day than they actually need because of the foods that they are eating outside of perhaps the home. Which brings us to obesity. Now, BMI, body mass index, is basically a measurement of your height versus your weight. And there is a number that we like people to shoot for. At teens, we begin to find that we're going to really have some issues, you might say, with obesity. What we also know, though, is that it may be among the easiest time for them to lose this extra weight. They tend to have more opportunities to be physically active. They tend to have more opportunities to watch what the nutrition they are eating. But it can be also very hard because a lot of their friends are eating other foods. This whole process of losing weight is not one that isn't easy for any age. But for teens, it may even have a greater social issue for them. And because overweight teens tend to be less popular and they tend to be made fun of, and you can see this in TV shows and stuff like this, it can also lead to isolation for these individuals. On the other hand, we have the eating disorders where people don't eat, anorexia. Now, one of the big things is that a lot of times when we talk about anorexia, we tend to think of this as a girl's disease. But notice in the little chart over there that while there's 3% of girls who do get an anorexia or bulimia, 1% of boys also develop this. And recently, it tends to be showing a little bit higher trending for boys. Boys may even be up to 2%, more on the anorexia side than they are on the bulimia side. Now, anorexia is sort of this fear of being overweight. They often have this unbelievable vision of who they believe they are. So from Introduction to Psychology, we talked about Carl Rogers. And he talked about the ideal self, the true self, and the self-image. Now, as those images all change, basically they do not match, we begin to find that teens will do something to try to make them match. Unfortunately, this is where the anorexia may come in because the girl or the young boy may look in the mirror and think that they are heavy and they need to lose more weight. Quite often, they don't start out to be anorexics, and in fact, quite a lot of times people don't realize they're anorexics for quite a long time. If you look at the image of that young lady and you look at the image of that young man, if they have clothes on, you may not even notice just how thin they are. Their faces look pretty normal. She just looks a little thin on the face. He just looks a little thin on the face. It's only once they take off their clothes do you begin to see just how thin they are. But put a pair of sweatpants on her and a sweatshirt and you wouldn't notice it. In fact, for the guy, if he puts on, kind of a bulky t-shirt, even with those shorts, he doesn't show his legs in this particular image. It may not be too hard to see. Now, one of the things about anorexia as far as young men are concerned and why there's a hypothesis that's increasing in boys is sort of this image that we now have of the popular young man. For girls, we've always had this image of this, thin young woman. In fact, the saying used to be saying that you can never be too young or too thin. But luckily today in fashion and many other areas, we're beginning to see women of normal weight. But for young men, it's kind of gone the other way around, where we used to see guys who are a little soft, maybe even a tad bit pudgy, as being, sort of sexy and sex symbols. Today, we see guys who are really ripped, who've got big six packs. And so if we're talking to a young man and he wants to look really ripped, one of the problems is that not only does he have to develop the muscles, but he has to have very little to no body weight on him to be able to see those muscles. So when you see some of these stars or some of these athletes who look really ripped all the time, first of all, they quite often exercise just before they were to go on camera or get their picture taken. It can also be spray tanned in a little bit to make it more dramatic. But they also have gotten way down in body fat because the body fat hides those rippling muscles. So if I'm a young man and I think I want to get that six pack, I'm going to have to become pretty thin in order for that six packs to show. Bulimia, on the other hand, is eating and purging. Now, eating and purging sort of concept quite often is done because of stress. And the stress is unbearable, you might want to say, in their life. And so they eat because, hey, it's time to eat and I don't feel good. And eating is a fun activity. I mean, chocolate tastes good, pizza tastes good. And as they show in this particular scenario here with some of the common symptoms of bulimia, we can also have very limited time to eat. So I'm trying to eat in the car, I'm trying to eat here. So when I do eat, I eat too much. But after I eat all this, I begin to feel bad because I might be a little overweight already, or I need to stay thin. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and purge the food. And that purging, that makes you feel good because you ate to feel good, but then you feel bad. And when you purge, all that badness comes back out of you. And so it becomes this sort of cycle of eating and purging. Unfortunately, there are websites that are actually dedicated to supposedly healthy bulimia and healthy anorexia. There is no such thing as healthy of either one of these. I read a story once of a lady who is a bulimic, and she had been for most of her life. And at one point, she gets pregnant. And she talks about how she got through bulimia with her pregnancy because she wanted her child to be healthy. And what she would do is she would eat her meal, and then she would eat a lot of carrots because she felt that if she got up in the middle of the night and had one of her sort of attacks, she had to go eat more food because she was just so stressed. And then when she'd go throw up, she'd throw up until she saw carrots. And when she saw the carrots, she knew she had to stop because the rest of the food in that system had to go to the child. So some of this bulimia is really well calculated, almost well thought out. So if you think about a high pressure person or a big star, something like this, they know they have to go out to a dinner party pretty soon. They're feeling very anxious, so they eat a little something because they don't want to look like they're going to overeat at the dinner party because everybody would look, oh, look how much she ate. So she eats a little bit there, and then she goes to the party and she gets a little nervous and she has some appetizers and then she has some of this and then she has some dessert because everyone's like, oh, have this wonderful dessert. And so when she comes home, she's beginning to feel really bad because now she's overeaten. And so she'll throw up. It gets to be this cycle of eating and purging, which can be really, really hard for some people to break. When we talk about threats to adolescence, one of the biggest things we need to talk about is this illusion of invulnerability. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to chapter 9. But basically, what we know is that for teens, they tend to think of themselves as being invulnerable. Things aren't going to happen to them. So they will take risks that other people wouldn't take. In fact, the World Health Organization at one point said the most dangerous thing about being a teen is being male. because they did such risky behaviors because they just didn't feel like they were going to hurt themselves. But the serious thing we also need to talk about is suicide. And for many of you, you may not have guessed that Native Americans were the most likely to commit suicide in their teens. In fact, while this chart might be a little outdated, it is significant among Native Americans. In the little print that is down in this area right here, let me see if I can highlight this. Notice that it said that even the Native American population may be underreported by up to 30%. That means is that while we say 3.4% of all suicides are from Native Americans, it could actually be a lot higher. And notice Native American males. And some people may say, well, why are Native American males more likely to commit suicide? There are several reasons. One, the reservations are really depressing places to live. If you've been to a true reservation, we're not talking about the Florida ones, we're talking about the ones that are out west. Some of these places haven't ever had running water. They have to truck in water actually from the outside. There is no future for them there. There is no hardly any education for them there. And then when they come off the reservations, the world looks at them differently, perhaps. We look at things like how they're portrayed in movies or even symbols. So a lot of you may have heard the controversy about whether the Washington Redskins should change their names because Native Americans find this very offensive to be called a Redskin, or the Indians as a baseball team. And their comment is would you ever have a baseball team called the Caucasians? And the answer is probably not. Or the Blacks. We probably wouldn't do that either. But it's okay to have the Indians. And I want to get back to Redskins for a moment because I learned this later on. The question came, why are they called Redskins? And people think it's because their skin is perhaps a little darker or more red color. And that's not it at all. It comes back from when Europeans first came to the United States. And we know that there were a lot of Native Americans, of course, already living here, and we wanted the same space as them. And so when the Indians and the Europeans, you might want to say, started to fight, we put out basically bounties. And one of the things that came out to be is that in order for you to get the money for killing a Native American, you had to bring in basically their scalp while it was still red. Meaning is that we still had red, it was still pink, it was fresh. Because they didn't want people doing is digging up graves and taking the scalps from there. So they had to be red skins in order for you to get your reward. So you see, where we see Redskins as not a big thing, for them, it basically represents a time period when they were hunted and killed. And they don't see it as a fun-loving, you might say, logo. So they have a lot of interesting things to deal with here in the United States. And because suicide may be a little bit more acceptable within their culture also, we see really high rates of suicide among Native Americans. So let's come to the brain of teens. One of the things that we have to understand is that teen brains are almost like adult brains. And in many ways, they are adult brains. One of the things that's really interesting, and there's a chart in your book to look at for this, is when people first look at this chart about processing speed that you see there, you think the processing speed is going down because you see a downward slope. And so you think, oh, that's getting slower. But if we really think about it, the downward slope actually means speeding up. So we're going from 500 to 200, which means it's going faster. By about 12, we've pretty much picked up what speed we're going to have. We don't see dramatic changes. Now, yes, we're still going to get a little faster from 12 to 21, but the speed of, or the increase in speed is much more minor compared to the increase of speed from 0 to 12 years of age. So already by the time we're hitting maturation, we've got pretty much our basic speed. What we do know is that at this point, children will have used heuristics, so this rule of thumb. If it's like this, it must be like that. Don't forget, these are concrete thinkers when we talk about children. But by the time we're adolescents, we are in the formal operation stage, which means that we have the ability to think in abstract. And if we have the ability to think in abstract, we have the ability to begin to have analytical thought and use logical analysis. So kids who may have just done things because that's how it's got to be done, adolescents will begin to question and challenge these things. They're kind of skilled at finding weaknesses and flaws or in reasoning because they haven't really had to do that before. So here's where the young adolescent will argue back with you on something. You might say something like, you need to go do your homework now because if you don't, you won't finish high school. And they say, oh, I'll finish high school because I've got a B in my class and all you need is a D to get out. So I don't really have to worry about doing that homework. See, they see a weakness in that argument because they know they only need a D and yet they have a B at this point, and one little homework to them doesn't mean that they're going to fail the class. Now, they will use heuristics just like you do. Every once in a while, they say, good enough, that's it. And you can think about some of the work that you've done, even some of the homework you're going to do. At one point, you might say, it's enough. There, it's done, and you move on. And you may or may not look up something in the textbook. It will be up to you to make that decision, but what we want you to understand in this lecture is that this is sort of how teens look too. Sometimes you're going to get into detail, and sometimes you're just going to go by your rule of thumb. Now, the last thing we're really going to cover in this is Kohlberg. Now, I wish we had a picture of Kohlberg I could put in, but it just didn't quite fit on this slide. Now, Kohlberg is pretty interesting here, and I noticed that my Kohlberg slide only says level 1 and 2. It's level 1, 2, and 3. Because he is probably the predominant way we look at moral reasoning development in young people. The one thing, though, with Kohlberg is that for this class, I want you to understand the levels. I don't want you to really memorize the stages. So these levels and the names of these levels, which is why they're in orange, are the ones that you would be tested on. Now, the stages are important right here, but what I have found is that in some of the classes or some of your particular programs, when you get into them, they might have slightly different names for the levels, the stages, but the levels are always the same. There's no changing the levels names. So we're going to focus a little bit more on the levels than the actual stages. I'll talk a little bit about those. So let's go over here to good old level 1. Now, level 1 right here, we like to say it's pre-conventional and it's all about punishment and reward. So I'm going to use a stop sign as an example, as a stage 1. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. You come to a stop sign. It's a 4-way stop, but you already know that one of the ways, there's absolutely nothing there. There's no houses. It's a dead-end road. And if you go to the left, there's one house on that road. So really, it's only somebody coming to the right, but yet it's a 4-way stop sign, and it's 4 o'clock in the morning, and you know there's going to be nobody else there because you're the one who lives in the one house that's on the left. But you stop. And you stop because you say to yourself, if I don't, I know there's going to be a cop behind that tree and they're going to give me a ticket. And I just got to stop because I just can't afford a ticket right now. So you've obeyed because you're trying to avoid punishment. You might want to say you've obeyed because of an authority figure. So we might call that a stage 1, where we might find those of you who are adults and have kids, you've had this happen to you. You're sitting on the couch all nice and happy like, and your little kid comes out and they start to pretend to massage your shoulders, or at least they try. And you're like, oh, thank you very much, honey. What is it that you want? Why are they massaging your shoulders? Because you know they want something. And it's their nice behavior in order to hopefully get some sort of future favor. Now, according to Kohlberg, young kids won't get past that stage while they're young. The next stage of development in moral development, the conventional, tends to start happening around our teens. In fact, it surges in our teens. What he says is that at some point we begin to make decisions because we think it is a socially accepted norm. So coming back to that expectation of the stop sign. In the middle of the night, you come to the stop sign, and now you say, well, even though I think this is really silly that there's a stop sign here, in order to maintain basically the rules of the road, I should stop. Because if I don't stop, then the next person's not going to stop, and the next person's not going to stop. And then all of a sudden we have chaos and a lot of crashes. So to maintain the order, social order of this world, I will stop. I may do a California stop and kind of roll it, but I'm going to slow down. I'm not going to just speed through it, because if I do it, then it's going to break the rules, and then we'll have traffic suggestions rather than traffic laws. So he would say that's conventional. You're doing your decision making based on social rules. Teens do a lot of this. They look at what their friends are doing or what other people are doing, and they tend to make decisions. Are you going to go do this? Well, I don't know. I got to see what Aiden's going to do. Mary may come out and be dressed in one way. Why are you dressed that way? Well, because Stevie and Cindy and Larry are all going to get dressed like this, so I feel like I have to get dressed this way. Why are you participating in this event? Well, my friends are doing it. So they're living up to these expectations that others have. Now, the last one, the post-conventional, it basically says that not everybody is going to reach this. And by the way, not everyone is making every decision only on one level. You can be an adult and one point, like stopping at the stop sign, you're using a level 1, and a few minutes later you could be using a level 3 decision. It's about the actual moral decision more than what your age is. Kohlberg just believed that young kids couldn't get past level 1, and that it's in your adolescence where level 2 begins to develop. Level 3, he says, can develop in your adolescence, but maybe a little later in your adolescence when you've got a little bit more brain development. And he calls it post-conventional moral codes. Now, here we have to be a little bit careful. When we hear moral codes, most of us think we have our own moral codes. And the truth is that you probably really don't have as much of a personal moral code as you think. A lot of our moral codes have been decided within our culture. We've kind of come to a decision that this is a moral code, like don't kill somebody, is a commonly shared moral code. What he's talking about here is when you might be willing to go against the social contract of moral codes. So I always like to use the Lovings. Now, the Lovings were a couple in the 60s who went to Washington, D.C. and got married. The thing is that one was black and one was white. And they went back to Virginia where they lived. In Virginia, it was against the law for a black and a white person to marry. So they broke the moral code. They did not feel it was valid that their skin color should dictate whether or not they could be a married couple. So they did not adhere to the social contract that only the same race people should marry. They said they don't think this is valid. Thus, they broke that moral social contract, you might want to say, because their moral code said that this was not a correct thing. And there are many times you may have not gone along with social moral codes because you did not feel it was valid. The last one in stage 6. Now that one's a little bit harder. He says there aren't many people like that, and they really aren't. When we say a personal moral system based on an abstract principle, now the key there is going to be the words abstract principle. Now this doesn't mean that you've made up a moral code and thus I've got an abstract principle. And he's talking about what principle drove your moral code. So the best one I can use is somebody I know who's a pretty strong vegan. If you understand veganism, it's not just about not eating animals. It is, in this case for her, the fact that she truly believes that animals were not put on this earth for us to take advantage of them, that we have developed in society that there is no reason for us to take advantage of an animal. So it's more than just not eating the animals. It would also be not riding an animal. After all, we have cars, she says, so why should I ride a horse when I've got a car? There's no reason to force a horse to, carry me. She will not buy any type of product that has leather in it. There is no reason for her to use the skin of somebody else for her own comfort. As she would say, is we wouldn't use the skin of humans to make a handbag. What makes it okay to use the skin of a cow to make a handbag? She quit her job after a while because her job was in a restaurant and the restaurant served meat. And she said she simply could not continue to work in a restaurant which basically went against her basic moral principles. So she took a job with a company that was to promote healthy animals and the health of animals, and she spends her weekends protesting farms. She is saving her money to buy a sanctuary so she can rescue turkeys and she can rescue pigs and other animals like that that are being brought to the slaughterhouse. She has a personal moral system that's based on an abstract principle that basically we are more sophisticated than animals, and as such, we should not use animals to help us live because we have grown beyond that type of technology. That's what he's talking about with stage 6. And he says there aren't a whole lot of people that get to that stage. Now, we do have to understand that different cultures will have different types of moral systems and look at it differently. Kohlberg, he tended to look at justice. He also tended to only ask young men. So there are many other kinds of moral development people out there that we tend to look at. Kohlberg I've picked because he is so predominant, you might want to say, in the studies that we have here in um, the medical world and in the studies that we have sort of in the United States. However, we do know is that Kohlberg's stages are not universal. While his things do tend to go toward Western philosophies and the religions of the Western world, they don't exactly adhere to many of the other religions. And if we want to think about, they give you Hindu here, but Nepal. If we go to Nepal, which is a rather religious place, but more in Confucianism, which is not really a religion, it's a philosophy, you would not find that his moral groups, you might want to say, would apply to that. However, for this class, we do want you to know those 4 levels of Kohlberg. Well, that's the end of chapter 8. If you have any questions, give me an email and I will respond. Have a good one, people.